The first strike, when a trade war splinters the American dream. Imagine waking up one morning to breaking news that stops your coffee mid-sip. US slaps 35% tariff on Canadian softwood lumber. Canada threatens to tighten exports. Is it just another policy shift? Or is it the opening salvo in a full-blown economic war? What began as a low-key policy adjustment has now erupted into a cross-border standoff capable of shaking the very foundations of the North American housing market. And as it turns out, the humble 2x4, an ordinary piece of lumber, has become the unlikely frontline weapon in a brutal geopolitical chess match. It started quietly in August 2024. Without much fanfare, the U.S. Commerce Department doubled tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, raising duties to 14.5%. Canada immediately protested, calling the move punitive, but few could predict what was coming next. On July 12, 2025, Washington dropped a hammer on the trade bridge with its northern neighbor, a sweeping 35% tariff on all Canadian lumber. It was a seismic shock, and just hours after the announcement, Canada responded not with words, but with action. British Columbia and Ontario, the lumber powerhouses of the North, hinted that export quotas were now on the table. That is diplomatic code for, if you escalate, so will we. And escalate they did. Convoys of lumber slowed to a trickle at border crossings. American builders, still reeling from high interest rates, suddenly found their lifeline to affordable wood evaporating overnight. Let's pause for a moment to understand the stakes. Canada supplies about 28 million cubic meters of softwood lumber to the U.S. every year. That's roughly one-third of all the lumber used to build American homes, apartments, and infrastructure. If Canada were to cap or cut exports, the U.S. wouldn't just lose a supplier, it would lose a structural pillar of its entire housing economy. Analysts estimate the fallout could tack on $10 to $14 to the cost of building a single-family home by 2027. For many families already priced out of the market, that could be the final nail in the coffin of the American dream. Yet while Washington postures and Canada retaliates, the construction industry bleeds. The situation becomes even more grim when you consider the limitations of America's own lumber industry. One might assume the U.S. can just ramp up domestic production to replace Canadian imports. That assumption is dangerously naive. Why? Environmental regulations. Opening new logging areas or expanding mills requires years of permitting, red tape, and environmental reviews. Labor shortages. The industry is short on skilled workers. Even current mills can't run extra shifts without enough trained crews. Natural constraints, wildfires, droughts, and sustainable harvest caps have all reduced the amount of usable timber in U.S. forests. In short, domestic sawmills can't just flip a switch. Industry leaders say it would take years to meet current demand without Canadian support. And Canada knows it. On July 16, 2025, Reuters reported that Ottawa was now preparing to formally restrict exports of lumber to the U.S., the first time in history such a move had been openly acknowledged. The motive? Protect Canadian jobs and ensure sufficient supply for a booming green building sector at home. In provinces like Ontario, mills are already operating at over 80% capacity to meet rising domestic demand. With that kind of pressure, why send premium lumber across the border, only to get slapped with punitive tariffs? So Canada decided to flip the script. Instead of pleading for trade justice, Canadian officials are turning their gaze east and west, not south. With trade agreements like CPTPP and CETA, Canada can sell its lumber and wood products tariff-free to countries like Japan, Australia, and the European Union. Those nations get premium Canadian wood at market prices, while the U.S. faces inflated costs from its own duties. It's a tactical pivot with strategic brilliance. Canadian mills are being encouraged to move up the value chain, producing engineered wood panels, prefab building materials, and even finished cabinetry. These goods not only fetch higher margins, but many also avoid the U.S. tariffs entirely. As one trade analyst quipped, the U.S. started a tariff war over 2x4 studs. Canada replied by selling entire skyscrapers to someone else. The implications are vast and sobering. Imagine a scenario where U.S. builders, struggling with labor and mortgage costs, now have to compete on the global stage just to access the wood they once took for granted. Each shipment from Canada becomes a carefully rationed commodity, not a reliable supply. Meanwhile, prices on lumber futures are already surging. $650 per thousand board feet in March and possibly rising to $765 or more if quotas bite hard before autumn. And here's the cruel irony. The U.S. built this trap for itself. Tariffs were meant to punish foreign suppliers and protect American jobs. But instead, they've driven up construction costs, squeezed builders, and nudged Canada to build stronger ties with everyone except the United States. This isn't just a trade dispute anymore. This is a structural threat to housing affordability, a strategic blunder that risks cutting America out of the supply chain it once dominated. And if the lumber fight is any indicator, this is just the opening battle in a broader war that's already creeping into steel, agriculture, and consumer goods. Stay with us. The ripple effect, when lumber turns into a national cost of living crisis. If part 1 was the opening shot, part 2 is where the shrapnel starts flying. The U.S.-Canada lumber dispute may have started as a targeted tariff action, but its effects are now exploding far beyond the forest. What was once a trade issue is rapidly becoming a full-blown cost of living crisis, and it's hitting average Americans square in the wallet. Let's take a moment to connect the dots. When Canada responded to the U.S. lumber tariffs by throttling exports, it didn't just create a timber shortage. It sent a shockwave through the broader economy, triggering panic in construction, driving up raw material prices, and jacking up housing costs in markets already strangled by high interest rates. But lumber is just the beginning. Steel in the crosshairs. Hot on the heels of the softwood standoff, the U.S. imposed 35% duties on imported hot-rolled steel sheets, a core material for everything from bridges to pickup trucks. The logic? Make imported steel more expensive so American mills become more competitive. The result? A classic backfire. In Detroit, a city still trying to rebuild its industrial base, automakers were suddenly staring at a $1.200 surge in the cost of building a mid-size pickup truck, just from the tariff alone. That doesn't include labor, parts, or supply chain bottlenecks. And that extra cost? Either the manufacturer eats it, or the consumer does, most likely, both, for a middle-class family shopping for a vehicle in 2025. That means higher sticker prices, fewer dealer incentives, and longer waits for new models. The economic punch isn't theoretical anymore. It's parked right there on the showroom floor. Agriculture under siege. Meanwhile, farmers, once celebrated as the backbone of American trade, are caught in a crossfire of a different kind. China, in response to U.S. tariffs on manufactured goods, retaliated by blocking imports of American beef. Simultaneously, U.S. farmers are paying more for everything they need to operate: fertilizer, tractor parts, grain storage bins, all of which are subject to increased import duties. You know what that means. Higher prices at the supermarket, not because of droughts or pests, but because tariffs are making it more expensive to grow food. Beef, corn, and wheat are all more expensive now than they were just a year ago. Not because demand spiked, but because input costs soared. And it doesn't stop there. Grocery prices, which had shown signs of cooling after the pandemic, are once again creeping up. That back-to-school shopping list? It costs more. The weekend hardware store run? It's more expensive too, not due to inflation alone, but because America's trade policy is now directly inflating the cost of living. The double-edged sword of protectionism. Washington insists these tariffs are designed to protect American industries and bring jobs back home. That's the official narrative. But here's the reality. Tariffs may shield a few sectors temporarily, but they raise prices across the board and often lead to job losses elsewhere. Factories paying more for inputs cut production. Small businesses unable to swallow rising costs reduce hours or lay off workers. And when higher prices hit consumers, spending slows, a recipe for economic stagnation. According to Yale University's Budget Lab, the cascade of tariffs is set to add an additional 2.1% to the Consumer Price Index. That may sound small, but for an average household, that's nearly $2.800 in extra annual expenses. And none of that appears on a tax form or ballot. It's a stealth tax, baked into everyday life. Even Wall Street is taking notice. Since the expanded tariffs were announced, the Dow Jones U.S. Home Construction Index has dropped nearly 8%. That's investors betting on fewer homes being built, and lower profits for the companies that build them. A housing collapse in the making? Let's go back to where this all began: lumber. The price of softwood lumber is surging again. And if Canada formalizes its quota plans this fall, experts predict prices could shoot beyond even the peak levels seen during the COVID-era building boom. For context, in 2021, skyrocketing lumber prices added up to $30 to the cost of a new home. Builders delayed projects, buyers pulled out, the market seized up. Now, in 2025, history is threatening to repeat itself. But this time, there's no pandemic to blame. It's entirely self-inflicted. Builders are bracing for the worst. Every plank, every sheet of plywood, every metal rebar is more expensive than it was 6 months ago. Construction firms are quietly shelving projects or padding their quotes with alarming contingency fees. The message is clear. The cost of protectionism is being paid by American families. The invisible border wall. Meanwhile, another front in the trade war is unfolding silently, but no less dramatically, at the US-Canada border. Customs data shows a plunge in cross-border car traffic at key gateways like the Rainbow Bridge and Peace Bridge. In western New York, county officials report a 7% drop in sales tax revenue, blaming the absence of Canadian shoppers who used to flock across the border for groceries, gas, and weekend deals. In other words, Canada isn't just choking off exports, it's pulling back its consumers. 2. Surveys revealed that 71% of Canadians plan to buy fewer U.S. goods this year. Not because of cost, but because of principle, national pride, resentment over tariffs, and fear of future disruptions are changing shopping habits, and it's hitting American retailers hard. Outlet malls near the border are reporting double-digit drops in foot traffic. Restaurants are closing early. Employees are getting fewer shifts. What began as a political maneuver is now eroding the microeconomies of entire towns. This is what a modern trade war looks like. Not tanks on a battlefield, but tariffs on construction materials. Empty parking lots at border malls. Families putting off buying a new car because the payments just got too steep. Beef farmers checking export logs with worry in their eyes. The American public is beginning to see a troubling truth. This isn't a war against foreign nations. It's a war against ourselves. Canada's masterstroke, when a lumber war becomes a global power play. So far, we've witnessed the escalation, from tariffs to retaliatory quotas, from rising costs to empty store aisles, from trade policy to pocketbook pain. But what if I told you, Canada isn't just defending its interests, it's quietly launching a strategic counteroffensive that may reshape global trade for years to come. And the United States may not even be the intended audience anymore. The pivot, from north to east. While Washington doubled down on punitive duties, Canada began turning its gaze toward new customers. Not out of spite, not even out of desperation, but out of opportunity. Thanks to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, and the Canada-EU Trade Agreement, CETA. Ottawa now holds 2 golden tickets: 0 tariffs on Canadian forest products across 11 Pacific Rim countries, duty-free access to key European markets for a wide range of wood goods. This changes everything. while U.S. buyers are stuck paying 35% markups due to their own government's policies. Countries like Japan, Australia, and Germany are lining up to buy Canadian lumber and value-added wood products at competitive, untaxed prices. Let that sink in. Canada doesn't need to win a fight with America. It just needs to stop showing up for the match, upgrading the arsenal, from logs to skyscrapers. But Canada's counterattack doesn't stop at redirection. It's also climbing up the value chain. Instead of flooding the U.S. market with raw 2x4 lumber, which is now expensive to ship and heavily taxed, Canadian mills are pivoting toward high-margin, finished products, engineered wood panels, prefabricated wall sections, ready-to-install cabinetry and flooring, even full modules for tall wooden buildings. These products often qualify for favorable trade treatment under CPTPP and CETA. Some even bypass U.S. tariffs entirely by not fitting the definition of raw lumber. The strategy is elegant and brutal. Instead of fighting over tree trunks, Canada is offering the world entire buildings. As one observer quipped, America started a tariff war over wood. Canada replied by selling skyscrapers to Tokyo. The economic chessboard shifts. So, what does this mean in practice? Let's look at the numbers. Canadian mills, especially in provinces like Ontario and Quebec, are now operating at near full capacity. But rather than sending that wood south, they're channeling supply into green construction projects at home and fulfilling export contracts overseas. The U.S., once the dominant buyer of Canadian lumber, is increasingly becoming an afterthought, an unreliable, overly politicized market. And it's not just lumber. Trade analysts are warning of a multi-sector squeeze on U.S. supply chains as Canada, China, and potentially the EU begin to pursue parallel trade paths that exclude or minimize American involvement. If Canada formalizes its lumber export quotas before fall, as expected, lumber futures could spike beyond pandemic highs. At the same time, the U.S. would still be dealing with elevated steel prices, rising food costs, and sagging housing starts. In other words, the trade war could collapse multiple rungs of the economic ladder, right in the middle of an election year. A silent but potent consumer rebellion. And let's not forget the people. While leaders battle it out through press conferences and tariff tables, ordinary Canadians are voting with their wallets and their anger. The 71% of Canadian consumers who say they'll avoid U.S. grocery products this year aren't just reacting to price. They're responding to perception, to a sense of being mistreated, of their industries being targeted unfairly. This isn't a boycott organized by government. It's a grassroots consumer backlash, and it may be more powerful than any tariff. Border traffic has plummeted. Outlet malls near Buffalo and Detroit are ghost towns. Restaurants that once served weekend cross-border diners are closing early or cutting staff. Every missed sale, every silent register, is another crack in the foundation of U.S.-Canada economic ties. And here's the thing. No executive order can force Canadian shoppers to return. Trade tensions may begin in Congress, but they're enforced in shopping carts. A dangerous political gamble. The longer this drags on, the more it becomes a domestic political liability for Washington. Elected officials can try to spin the tariffs as toughness or America first bravado. But voters aren't blind. They're seeing housing costs balloon, grocery bills rise, car prices surge, and the very cross-border communities they live in start to dry up. In Erie County, New York, local officials reported a $4.9 million sales tax shortfall, blamed squarely on the loss of Canadian shoppers. Retail strategists warn that American businesses near the border could lose up to one-third of their weekend revenue. Meanwhile, job postings in construction are starting to freeze as firms hold off on projects due to cost uncertainty. This isn't theory, it's reality, unfolding one invoice and one layoff at a time. The final nail? Let's be blunt. The United States launched a tariff offensive thinking it could squeeze Canada into submission. Instead, Canada is executing a pivot so well-crafted it's turning the tables, economically, diplomatically, and morally, by exporting value-added goods, finding new markets, and redirecting national sentiment inward. Canada is positioning itself not as a victim, but as a victor in a smarter, more sustainable trade future. Meanwhile, America risks isolating itself behind walls that were supposed to protect jobs, but now trap inflation inside. This isn't just a lumber war. It's a case study in how protectionism, when miscalculated, burns bridges it was meant to defend. And the longer it goes, the more painful the reckoning. Because in this war of tariffs, the real casualty might be trust. Trust in trade, trust in affordability, trust in the idea that prosperity can be built, not taxed, into existence.